Hello everyone, this is County Historian Lord Tippin. We have been doing a series on what we call tiny towns, vanished villages of Putnam County. And today I want to talk about New Maysville, a community northeastern Putnam County, Jackson Township. As you're viewing this, I want to remind you that you can pause at any time, or if I get ahead of you, like if you want to read a newspaper article or something, I've gone through it too fast, you can grab this and pull it back so you can read it again. We can't go through everything. There's a lot of valuable information in a recently published book on New Maysville by Malcolm Romine, available at the Putnam County Museum and other locations. Very nice book. New Maysville was platted in 1832 by Richard Biddle on land owned by Orenthal Talbot, John Johnson, William Wells, and Aquila Talbot. Named it Maysville after Mason County, or New Maysville after Maysville in Mason County, Kentucky. Richard Biddle was born in 1803 in Kentucky. We're not sure, but we think Bourbon County. Died in 1888. I found the Sons of American Revolution application for his father, who's also named Richard, who served in the Revolutionary War. It was kind of interesting to see that. Let's talk about some of the prominent citizens first. Let's talk about Dr. William Long. This is one of the tall tombstones in the New Maysville Cemetery of Dr. Long. He was born in Shelby County, Kentucky in 1810. Came to Lafayette in 1833 to practice medicine, then to New Maysville in 1834. He married a local named Harriet Gregory. And he said in his writings, Dr. Long did, he arrived in the dead of winter when there was still a howling wilderness. And the only way he could reach his patients was through the blazed path through the dense forest wilderness. He died in 1880. Practiced medicine for nearly 40 years in New Maysville. Over 6 feet tall, said to have weighed more than 300 pounds. The 1879 Atlas reported him to be the largest man in the county, which was also noted as his obituary, the Greencastle Star, May 22nd, 1880. The photo of Dr. Long on page 47, the 1879 Atlas of Putnam County, which has recently been reproduced, available at Putnam County Museum. It's kind of interesting how they did the pencil drawings of these people, but this is what Dr. Long looked like on a page of representative physicians of Putnam County. The fourth child of William and Harriet was Dr. Robert Long, born 1843, served in the 78th Indiana Infantry Civil War, practiced medicine in Maysville for 10 years. Then he moved in 1875 to Irvington, which was on the east side of Indianapolis, at that time a suburb of Indianapolis. In addition to the practice of medicine, Dr. Robert Long made a large fortune in real estate investments. Dr. Long and his wife Clara donated a total in 3 different installments of $345,000 to the state to build the Robert Long Hospital at Michigan Street in Indianapolis. That's over $10 million in today's money. It's a large sum of money. He hoped the hospital, which opened in 1914, would serve primarily those in rural communities, like New Maysville. 1914, Putnam County did not yet have a hospital. And if you go to some of the old newspapers, articles in the Hoosier Chronicles, you can see where people from New Maysville and Greencastle and other areas of Putnam County have gone to Dr. Long's Hospital in Indianapolis for treatment, operated under Indiana University. The photo in the IUPI archives, the building's actually on the IUPI campus on Michigan Street, not far, just a little bit west of the main hospital campus there. Building's still there. You can still see where it says Robert Long Hospital, although it's no longer used as a hospital, kind of across from the dental school, if you know where that's out on Michigan Street in Annapolis. Dr. Long and Clara had no children of their own, but they had sort of a stepson, kind of adopted son, I should say. It's kind of an interesting relationship they had with him. Remembered him in his will and quite a few other instructions. Gave a lot of money to charity when he died in 1915. It was said that Dr. Long was such a compassionate person. He would help clothe and feed people, never turned anyone away. Apparently a very compassionate person. And we found his will, which Malcolm Romine included in his New Maysville book, which is kind of interesting. One of the instructions in the will, they should have a specific type of monument, which shall be placed on a concrete foundation which extend at least 6 feet below the ground. We calculated this out, and that would be about 3 trucks of cement, 3 truckloads of cement, just for the foundation of the base of this stone. Not too tall, he said, although it is fairly tall and fairly large. It costs $1,500 to $2,000, be the best, because that's 1915 money, so that's a lot of money. And desired my body be placed in the largest, latest improved copper-lined burial casket, and the grave be prepared in the most improved way of cement. It's kind of an interesting structure. His grave. This is his passport application. The reason I'm showing this mostly is because the description of Dr. Long said had a high forehead, a long face, sandy, freckled complexion, hard green eyes, which is exactly what you see. It is obituary, 1915, when he died, the Annapolis News and several other papers, which is a very interesting read. There's also a photo of Dr. Long and his wife Clara, Malcolm Romine's New Maysville book that Phil Klopfelder found. Take a picture of it. It's very interesting. After his death in 1915, Clara then, his widow, came to Annapolis to pay her respects more or less on an annual basis, driven by her driver, Big John, in a maroon Hudson. If you've seen the movie Driving Miss Daisy, it's exactly like that. While Mrs. Long was at her husband's grave, paying her respects, Big John would tend to the flowers in large urns flanking the tombstones. This annual event until Clara died in 1945. Big John, then, the driver, compassionate man, continued to pay his respects, tend the flowers till his death in the 1960s. Paid some locals to come also tend the flowers and weed them year long. Very compassionate person. This is the photo of Dr. Long's tombstone, and the photo does not do justice to how large this stone is. It is massive. And then here's the receptacles where he and Clara are buried. And some of the locals that I've talked to, some of them living, some gone, remember their Clara and Big John coming out and paying respect to Dr. Long's grave. On the front cover, Malcolm Romine's Maysville book, we have Joyce Turner's store. This is the way I remember it. Doesn't look like this now. It's about to fall over. But this is what it was like when I was a kid. I was raised near New Maysville, several different locations that we lived, several farms that we had. I remember the little gas pump and the front porch. You could sit on her metal chairs and have her soda pop, which she had in a water-filled cooler, candy bar, which at that time had price been raised from a nickel to a dime, which outraged everyone. Had posters on the wall, World War II, imploring the soldiers in the poster, imploring you to help in the good fight, which had been settled many years prior. Very interesting. The building was believed to be built in 1832 as a two-story log cabin by Colonel John Talbot. The banner graphic in 1977 has an article highlighting Turner's store, saying it was at that time the second oldest store in the state under continuous operation. Delbert Joyce purchased the store in 1955 from Mr. and Mrs. John Forney. Bruce Mills ran a post office southwest corner. There's a barber shop on the west side. The Oddfellows met in the large upstairs room. We knew it as the New Maysville Mall. In Minnesota, there's Mall of America, but boy, this was our mall. This is what we considered the major shopping center. Delbert was a welder. Joyce operated the store by herself and had the lowest prices in the county for many items. It was robbed several times. One time, the local boys, teenagers, did not plan the robbery very well because in the middle of the winter, it's very easy to track the footprints in the snow after they left from their robbery. Soon apprehended and reprimanded. His tombstone in the Maysville Cemetery of Lydia Tilgham Hannah, who were murdered in their sleep in Groveland in 1861. We'll talk about that another time. They're at the New Maysville Cemetery. But we'll talk about this stone. This is the stone of Daniel Higgins and his wife, Julia Case Higgins, recently been restored. One thing that's interesting, his stone said, killed on the railroad, July 11th, 1867. Well, that's a story that needs to be explored. So I go to the Straight Chronicles and find several articles about this in the Indianapolis Daily Herald and then the Banner at times. Said Daniel Higgins of New Maysville, Esquire, so maybe he was an attorney, I'm not sure, was killed near Sidney, Ohio. Sidney, Ohio is just a little bit east of Richmond, Indiana. He was taking a load of cattle to New York, and apparently the train passed under a bridge that didn't have that much clearance, and Higgins raised his head, and that was the end of Daniel Higgins. That was it. There's a lot more to the story, though. There's another article I found during the research in 1894. We've got to read this one. This is repeated from the Ladoga Leader. It's in the Greencastle Banner and Times. 28 years ago, Daniel Higgins died. His body is buried in a metal casket in the Maysville Cemetery. His widow married George Mullen. It's supposed to be Mullen. And they moved to Ladoga. Well, she had typhoid fever and became insane. She was taken to the hospital in Indianapolis. It was actually the hospital that became Wishard. Is not expected to live much longer, although she did live until 1913. Spent most of the time in the hospital because she was very ill. But they thought she was going to die in 1894. They thought it best to remove the casket of her husband, apparently to move it over to make room for her. Accordingly, one night last week, George Case Lee Case, brother and cousin respectively, of Julia, accompanied by John T. Higgins of New Maysville, son of Daniel Higgins, and several others, went to the cemetery to remove the casket. They opened the lid and looked through the half-inch glass. It was not uncommon to have somebody buried, actually, is in a coffin, not a casket, with glass, so you could do a viewing, even though the lid has been nailed down of the coffin. So you'd have a glass-lined window, really, so you look in. Then they said the body and clothing looked exactly as it did the day he was buried 28 years ago. Mrs. John T. Higgins, another, and her children were wakened. 2 or 3 other women accompanied them to the cemetery. For the first time they removed their rings and lingered there. Work was done at night on account of the heat and greater privacy, and probably kind of creepy to be digging at midnight, as they say, in a cemetery. Then the well-preserved body was again lowered in a new grave. So apparently they did move him over to make room for her. But the story does not end there. Very complicated, very long story. Daniel Higgins, who had married Julie Case in 1852, had several children, including John T. Higgins, who we just read about. And there was a different couple, not related, named George Mullis, who had married Lydia Van Sant in 1860. They had one child, Leona. After Daniel died in 1867 and Lydia Mullis died in 1868, Daniel was left with several children to raise. And, Julia, after Daniel died, was left with several children to raise. And then Lydia, after she died, George Mullis had the one daughter. And it was not uncommon then for a widow and a widower to get together and marry, because the men just really couldn't cook and clean. They didn't have time. It was an all-day event. You didn't just pop your food in the microwave at the time. And the women needed the security of the men, so it's not at all uncommon for a widow and widower to remarry, which they did in 1870. Then they moved to Ladoga. Julia was the daughter of John Quinn Case, one of the cases of New Maysville. But I want to show you this. This is the tombstone we're looking at of Daniel Higgins, and this is the one of George Mullis. This is the new part of the New Maysville Cemetery, and then the old part, the original part, across the road to the north. And from this tombstone to the one I'm pointing at, you could throw a baseball from one to the other. It's not as far away as it looks. And you see Lydia, the wife of George Mullis, died 1868. And notice the stone was George. And then beside them was her daughter Leona, who was 8 years old when she died in 1871. I did even more research on this and found this heartbreaking article in 1871. Originally from the Ladoga Herald, reprinted Greencastle Banner and Times. And on Saturday afternoon, our people were shocked. The announcement streets that little Johnny Higgins, stepson of Mr. George Mullis, had shot in some way Mr. Mullis's little daughter, aged 8, who was his only child. He reported the pistol and screams brought neighbors in, who found shot on the floor. She died within an hour. Very sad, sad story. And all started because I saw that Daniel Higgins was killed on the railroad. Then we saw this long, encompassing saga here. It's a very sad tale. And then Julia, after all this, she died in 1913, still pretty much in the hospital the whole time. She's buried beside her first husband, and you wouldn't know that any of this ever happened. The Maysville Homecoming was a big event in New Maysville. It started in 1905. Pasture of Lord Summers, which had large grove of shade trees over many acres. People would come from miles around in the horse and buggy, the Model T. I remember when I was younger talking to people who are no longer with us, who had attended the New Maysville Homecoming, which was a very big event, large event. So the homecoming picnics, they remembered, was already held in the third week of August. The paper account, the Greencastle Herald, of August 1910, saying the New Maysville 5th Annual Homecoming will be held in Lloyd Summers Grove, 1 mile south of New Maysville, on Thursday, August 25th. A number of good speakers will be present, including a congressman. People would bring basket dinners and spend the day. Sometimes they would pack extra sandwiches to sell to those that forgot to pack one of their own. And they had well-known speakers. The event became such a huge picnic with games, remember to play cards, They were just large events, and then they had some vendors also selling food and other items. One of the popular events in the 1920s was said to be the airplane rides, which take off on the south side of the road, probably east of where the picnic grounds were. The rides are 75 cents, quite popular, especially among the younger set, although most of them did not have that 75 cents. The picnic then was discontinued in the late 1930s. Talk about the schools. The first school in Jackson Township, according to various historical records, was taught by Mark Herndon in 1831 on Log Cabin Section 20. Dr. Long then donated land for a school in Maysville in 1849, which we believe was the first school building built in New Maysville. See, in the 1864 map of Putnam County, it was courtesy of Library of Congress, where the school was located. It was pretty much then on the east end of town. And then 1894, the original school burnt to the ground, replaced by a new building almost immediately, 1894. Building was remodeled in 1910. They had a 4-year program in the early 1900s. They combined then with elementary classes, with some of the high school teachers also teaching elementary subjects. During the early 20s, the Maysville School was accredited 3-year high school. Then 4-year classes were cut to 3 in 1925, and then the township closed the high school part and sent those students to Bainbridge. But the elementary was still there, had 127 pupils, according to various sources. Brick building had 2 rooms on the first floor, grades 1 through 4, and 4 to 6, and then grades 7 and 8 with upstairs rooms. The grade school closed in 1943, and then all the students were bused to Bainbridge. The brick building was sold then, 1974, turned down, the bricks were salvaged, and then only a walk and then some bricks remained. And an article in 1976 was talking about it, although in the 1980s, a home was built there. It's no longer a vacant lot. This is what it looked like. This is from Schools in Your Hand, a very nice publication from the retired teachers of Putnam County, published in, I believe, 1976. So this is a photo of the Maysville School, probably not long before it was torn down, 1974. And also in Schools in Your Hand, we have some photos of the classes. This is the 1925, which is significant because it was the last time they had the high school class. If you want to pause and read the names, or you can get this book, Schools in Your Hand, and read it at your leisure. Very nice. I knew a lot of these people, and I'm related to some of them. And also the 1919 class. And I knew this little guy quite well. And again, if you want to pause it or get the book Schools in Your Hand at the library, it's very nice. So about churches. The Christian church was organized the first Sunday of July, 1839, according to various historical sources. Nathan Walters and Gib Harney are recognized organizers. Gib Harney was a circuit rider who organized many churches, many churches in this part of the state of Indiana. In 1840, a log building was erected in Maysville, burnt to the ground in 1856. The congregation built a new church building. And then the Christian church closed in 1936, reopened in 1944 and renamed as the Maysville Community Church. Closed again, reopened in the 50s, and then the 1980s, closed and then reopened again, 1988. It still has services and welcome, all denominations welcome the Maysville Community Church. It was a very confusing but interesting set of articles in 1879 and 1910 history that Malcolm Romine has discussed in his recent book of New Maysville. I think we've got some of this confusion cleared up. It says one report has the regular Baptists organized in New Maysville in 1832. However, another has a date as 1840. For many years, the church building is located on the farm of Jesse Eggers, according to Jesse Weeks' 1910 history. But Malcolm Romine notes this is a bit confusing, as he later states the second house of worship township was built in Maysville soon after the town was laid out, which would have been 1832. Okay, the farmer Jesse Eggers caught my eye. It's very significant. He was my 5 times great uncle. Looking at the 1879 Atlas and History of Putnam County, the Jackson Township section says the regular Baptists organized a congregation in Jackson Township about 1832. The present church building is located at the farm of Jesse Eggers. The second house of worship, this township built in New Maysville by this denomination soon after the town was laid out, which had been 1832. And then the organization of the missionary Baptists in the town dates from 1841. Also in the 1879 Atlas, the map of Jackson Township, at the intersection of County Road 650 East and US 236, about 4 miles east of Rochdale and a few miles west of Fort Red, which is now Barnard, we see a Baptist church, not just any old church, a Baptist church, and schoolhouse number 6. This is another map that I ran across called Postal Routes 1912, where they list or include the post offices and who carried the mail. We see at that intersection, see now Barnard and then a community called Wheaton, which had a post office. We talk about Barnard and Wheaton at a different time, but we see a church. And then schoolhouse number 6 is down here a mile south. Milton Eggers, nephew of Jesse Eggers, built this school, donated land to build this school, I should say, because it burnt down about 1900. They built a new brick building, which has recently been raised a mile south of that. But the church is still there, and you see this word friendship. Friendship. It's the only map you'll see that, and that helped resolve this question about the Baptist church. As part of the Barnard and Wheaton presentation, I have a lot of information on this Friendship Church. Noted is in the Wheaton area, which is near where that church was located. And you can read more about this, again, in the Barnard Wheaton presentation. But it talks about the Friendship Church and also at least one instance without a large revival. Then you have Elder Levi Buchanan, who is a noted minister from New Maysville, and Abner Fields at Wheaton. And then the Baptist Church believed to have been built present location on the east side of the road as one enters New Maysville from the south. About the time of the Civil War in 1861, we see it, 1864 map, we're going to see in a second. But several local residents remembered the Baptist Church being perhaps on the other side of the road and a little bit north of the current building. Let's talk about the Methodists, and then we're going to look at the maps. Methodists then, according to various historical references, 1879, 1910, and others, held their first church meetings in the township at the house of John Johnson. That's very significant. Remember that name, John Johnson. The Shiloh Church, built on the east bank of Walnut Creek, was erected about 1834, the first church building in the township for the Methodists. The Reverend Thomas Brown dedicated the building, preached first sermon in this new building. The east bank of the Big Walnut Creek is significant because there really only could have been 3 places that church could have been. It could have been farther south at near the Rolling Stone Bridge, However, there's no church or cemetery or anything else noted there. About 4 miles west of New Maysville, there's a cemetery, which is called Kaufman and Job. But there's no documentation of a church nearby. Sometimes you think when there's a cemetery, there may have been a church. But we see no indication here of a church. The only other location, it could have been two more. It could have been here, but it could have been here. Let's look at this in section 21. This is the road that goes from Maysville to Rochedale. We see at the east bank a big walnut in 1879, a BSSH. I don't know what they mean, and I don't know if that SH possibly could have been Shiloh. I've always wondered about that. But if it is at a B, that may be even noted as Baptist, although we know Shiloh is a Methodist church. It's a little confusing, but we're not going to let this go. We're going to keep researching this. Remember that name of John Johnson, his brother James. This is the original land patent, where you can obtain from the Bureau of Land Management's website, which indicates take out the land patent, which is the first transfer of land to the United States government to the first settler, just east, literally just east of where that church building was located. So James Johnson, the brother of John, owned that land in those early days. And then this is interesting. This is from the 1879 Atlas of Putnam County, an historical record. It recognized as being our first compiled history. But we've recently discovered, thanks to Hoosier Straight Chronicles, some source documents. 1879 did not cite their sources, which I think is a very major transgression in any kind of historical work. But we see that they get some of this information from this 1877 article in the Greencastle Banner by James Cooper. Very long article. This is the very end of it, signed by James Cooper. And then the editor of the Banner is asking for people to send in histories. And we have found numerous histories now, based on this, of the county and the different townships of the county. And we can tell based on some of the phrases and so forth, 1879 got their information from these articles, although 1879 took great liberties and changed information. But this is more of a source document of Jackson Township. Now, you have to remember a few things. This James Cooper was a frequent submitter to the newspapers. He wrote a lot of political opinions, op-ed, so to speak. He even wrote some poems. So he was a frequent contributor to the Banner. He lived from 1820 to 1885. So he's remembering things that happened 30, 40 years prior. So you have to remember that when you read his work. But again, a lot of it did roll up into the 1879. And then in that article, again, which is a very long article, he's talking about the first meeting house erected in the township was Silo on the east side of Walnut near Cox's Mill. Okay, that was omitted in 1879. This is very significant. The house was erected by the Methodists. Then the next meeting house was built by the Baptists, reached some of the first preachers and so forth and so on. And the Methodist house in Maysville, and that building was built by the Christian Church. It was erected in 1835. And then he's even saying that in his hasty sketch, he knows he's omitted some people, but he did say perhaps John Johnson, remember that name, did as much as any other for the moral and religious training of people, as he had 4 sons who were circuit riders. Okay, let's study this Cox's Mill. It's very significant that we see this. This is section 21 again. And we see down here in section 20, heirs of Nathan Cox, who had died not long prior to that. And we see this road, which is a dead-end road now. The bridge washed out and never was replaced. This is where Cox's Mill was. And notice, remember that article, it didn't say at Cox's Mill, but near Cox's Mill. And then we see the land patent of Nathan Cox, which was in section 20, where we saw that land. So I think we can say with a great deal of certainty then that Cox's Mill was here and the Shiloh Church was right here in section 21 on the road that goes to Maysville to Roachdale. Now, I was talking about the Methodist Church again. In 1862, John Masson gave land for the Methodist Church. And this article in 1866 is saying the newly erected Methodist Church in the village of New Maysville, dedicated the first Sunday of June of that year. Reverend Bowman will preach the sermon. The Methodist Church was abandoned probably in the 20s or 30s. When Malcolm Romine did his research for his New Maysville book, he asked me a few questions about that, and he interviewed some of the elders, and they really couldn't remember the Methodist Church. So it comes back to where it's vacant, probably as early as the 30s, maybe even the 20s even, I don't know. But it's a vacant lot now. And this is a very significant photo. Someone asked me who I thought this person was. I said, without hesitation, this is Noble Storm. Lived in New Maysville in a big 2-story white house. House is still there. Noble Storm lived 1900, 1970, so I certainly remember him. And I know this is the way he dressed. He probably had 10 different versions of this same outfit, and he wore this same hat every single day. This was a vacant lot just west of where his home is now, a vacant lot. And we're certain this was a Methodist church in New Maysville. And then he had a store then just west of that. So we're confident this was Noble Storm and this was Methodist Church. We don't know when this photo was taken. Unfortunately, his face is a little blurry, not a very good quality picture. Noble Storm was one of those kind of guys who, when he was 70, he passed to somebody being 30. So it's very hard to date this photo because of that. But we're pretty confident that was Noble Storm at the Methodist Church. Map of the churches. The Baptist Church then was where it is now. It's 1864 map, courtesy of the Library of Congress. This is a vacant lot now where the Methodist Church was. Here's where Noble Storm lived, big 2-story white house. This is where a store was. I remember that store, which was kind of across, or you'd say catty corner, from Joyce Turner's store, small store. That's competing store at one time. Then here's the school, and then the Christian church. And this BS or CSH or something, can't really know what it is, but I wonder if this has something to do with the Baptist church, where some people, the elders, people with life experience, some no longer living, have said they thought something about the Baptist church was across the street to the north. I wonder if that was that. I'm not sure. And do you know that New Maysville was one time an incorporated town? For a short period of time. This is from 1891, proceedings of the Senate, where David Ader, representing Putnam County in the Senate, introduced a bill legalizing the incorporation of New Maysville, Putnam County, and it passed. New Maysville was incorporated in 1891. Then we see an article in 1892, just 1 year later, Green Council Star Press, where they have the news of New Maysville for the preceding week. These are so much fun to read. And if you want to go to the Hoosier State Chronicles and to type in New Maysville, you get tons of these. I love reading these articles. If you want to pause and read some of this, it's representative of that time. But also on that page, separate from this, there's this. The town of New Maysville as a corporation is no more, is now part and parcel of Jackson Township. So Maysville was incorporated for 1 year. This was the former home of Madison Keck, significant to me, about 2 miles north of New Maysville on what we call Ground Squirrel Road, gravel road. Log cabin, been there many years, sadly burnt to the ground about, I think, 15 years ago now. I don't remember exactly. But this is a photo of what the log cabin looked like before it burned, and I very distinctly remember this. Another interesting photo of a home near New Maysville, between New Maysville and Bainbridge. Malcolm included this in his Maysville book, where there's a painting of Elijah Cowgill now hanging in the gallery at Putnam County Museum about various locations, various homes, and he painted this one saying unknown. Well, we know where it is. We know that we believe this stone house was built in 1831 on private property, but it's near Big Walnut Creek on the bluffs above it, not far from the Rolling Stone Bridge. And you can see, the current owner pointed out, you can see where it looked like the limestone was taken from the hillside to construct this home. And if you want to read more about New Maysville, again, you can go to Malcolm Romine's recently published book. You can read about the shootout that occurred in New Maysville, Easter Sunday, 1980. Hall of Famer Fiddler Johnston and his famous work, The New Maysville Stomp, and other articles about New Maysville. So I hope you've enjoyed learning a little bit about the history of New Maysville, Jackson Township. Come back, we'll learn about some other locations next.